All right, welcome to another video. Are you with me, Mr. B?
I am.
All right, very good. So today we talked about on the last video the battles of the Civil War. Today we're going to talk about what was the politics going on, the government issues during the Civil War, and a little bit before. We're not going to go into all the compromises from the 3/5 to Missouri to 1850 and the nullifications. But real quickly, your thoughts on how America goes from a free country to divided. So, what are your thoughts on the causes, I guess, of the Civil War, to oversimplify it?
I think that it was a series of compromises that at the time were the best interest of the country, but ultimately they ended up pushing us towards the Civil War, where you had a select group of Southerners who kept pushing the boundaries more and more and more, and ultimately they kept getting what they wanted, and that ultimately caused it. It was just a series of compromises, and that led us towards those, where the South kept taking more and more and more, and then ultimately you have Lincoln that comes on the scene, and he pretty much says enough is enough. We've compromised as it is. It's time that the Union takes a win rather than just the South.
And one thing we want to make sure that we state, and I think it sometimes gets lost in history classes, that a lot of these decisions made in the South, and we say the South, but really we're talking about a Southern elite class, not really representative of the white middle class or even the white poor class. A lot of the decisions based on slavery really only helped the elites and the government officials of the South. They were getting what they wanted, not necessarily the people of the South. And so I want to make sure that we state that. You agree? Like we often say
Sure.
North and South, and we say South, and we just lump everyone into it.
Right.
Yes, Southerners will fight for the Confederacy, but if you look at it economically, if I'm a poor white Southern man during this time period, I don't own slaves, and I can't get a job because all of the work is taken by slaves. So my life is actually made a little bit more difficult. It doesn't really make any sense. And as slavery expands out west, that's even less opportunities for me if I wanted to be a farmer. If when Texas becomes a slave state, Texas then can be plantations and big farms that belong to, once again, this southern rich elite class or the conspirator slave power. It just means less for the middle class and the lower class.
Right.
We
Right.
often overlook that because we're always saying, well, North and South, because it's easier. And
Right.
you start doing the video, it's just going to say North and South. And that's fine. But the big issue is obviously it's going to be the state's rights to have slaves. And it's not necessarily what the people want, it's what the people who control the state governments want. Because it's in their
Right.
best economic interests.
Well, and I think too, it's going to end up towards the end, at least. They see the writing on the wall as the Civil War is coming, and they see that as a chance for them to hold power in the Confederacy. And that's kind of conspiratorial, but it's them flexing their power. Henry Clay and all these guys flexing their power at the time. And then you see John C. Calhoun jump on the bandwagon, and he says, "Ooh, I have a chance to potentially be the president of the Confederate States of America. If I push these boundaries, then I can have personal power." And I think that plays right into that slaved elite. It's even the political elite that push that there too. So they push them to the limit. They push it to the limit as much as they can.
And we see some similarities with that today with our politicians, once again, not really representing us, but fighting these ridiculous causes and flexing their power on TV, fighting against our president or fighting against anything that the other side does, really not to make the country better, but it's strange, but
It
just
is.
for a power struggle for politicians, I guess, to prove
Right.
their worth.
Well, and I mean, it happens today. It happened then. It'll happen tomorrow. It'll happen 10 years down the road. I guess what we probably should focus on more, getting a little bit off topic here, is we should probably get towards the politics of the Civil War rather than just our own Debbie Downer, the powers that be are against us. Don't you think?
Yeah, there are similarities though. People not really
Sure.
solving problems because you look at the compromises and you look at politicians trying to help themselves probably more than people, trying to look good and Whatever, you are right. We're getting off topic. Let's go back into the Civil War. So here we go. One of the early things that's going to happen is an income tax will be created in the North to help pay for the war. We might say, well, so what? But that is kind of a big deal, considering the nation had been around for almost 100 years and there wasn't an income tax. Now, we don't really blink our eye about an income tax. It's just the way it is. But that's a big deal for the government to come in and all of a sudden say, hey, we are going to tax your income.
Right. And in a regard, though, I think that's a fair thing to do as an income tax, because if you remember during the Civil War, many wealthy citizens of the North decided that they were going to pay their way out of the Union Army or hire a substitute, or basically just dodge the draft, like during the Vietnam War. Most of your wealthy individuals dodged the draft in the Vietnam War, and so an income tax, to me at least, seems rather fair. It almost seems like a rather it seems like a win for a trade-off. It's a good trade-off, because hey, I don't have to go fight. Okay, fine, you're going to tax my income. Gee, I'm making too much money anyway. Or, well, no, you can never make too much money, but I'm making dozens of millions of dollars. Okay, fine, I don't have to go fight. I'll pay some income taxes. So for somebody who would have been probably a very poor Northerner, if he had been a Northerner, I'm happy to see that income tax.
And we still have the same thing today with the wealthy classes. The people that fight our wars are often the middle to lower class today. People who fight in our army and defend our country more often than not come from lower socioeconomic standpoint and are economically disadvantaged, often join the military because that is one of the few ways to pull themselves up and to find jobs and opportunity. And so once again, but the difference today is, you would argue that, yeah, just like then, our middle to lower classes are the people who have to fight these wars. But back then, like you said, we had an income tax that charged those who escaped war. Even during the 60s, during Vietnam and 70s, we had a pretty strong income tax. So if you were wealthy and found your way around war, you still had to pay for it. Now, today, I don't know if that bargain still holds up. I see that our lower classes economically still fight the wars, but I don't know if the upper class is paying for the wars the way that it used to be.
No, I think the middle class is fighting and paying in a lot of times.
And also during this time, we have the issue of the greenback of the dollar bill. You'll see in the top right. Once again, you say, well, so what? Well, this is another big economic change. You may remember from some of the other videos when we talked about panics and the instability of paper money and how the price, it suffers from inflation. The value of paper money is very mercurial. It'll go up and down, unlike coins. What are you laughing?
Just you and the word mercurial. You love that word. I've heard you say it I don't know how many times over the time I've known you.
But that's the problem with paper money, and we've had so many battles in the past through the early 1800s over paper money, mainly with Andrew Jackson. But now this is an example of the government saying, no, we're gonna stick with this paper money thing, and this is really going to be the origin of the dollar bill that we have today. Before this time period, there really wasn't really a federal note like there is today.
Right.
Big change leads to, well, the world we live in. So then let's talk about another big political issue, which I guess still exists today, conscription, or what we refer to as a draft. That is when you do not volunteer for a war, you are forced to fight a war as part of your civic duties. Your thoughts on these draft riots and the drafts during the Civil War? You kind of alluded to those a second ago with the wealthy not having to fight. Right,
and a good bit of it too was the fact that in the South and in the North, I think, especially as the war dragged on, people realized, hey, whoa, I'm not even really going to benefit from this. I'm not going to benefit if the slaves are free. I'm not going to benefit if they're not free. I'm not, in the South it was, I don't benefit from slavery. I don't benefit if there isn't slavery. And so they became pretty disenchanted with the whole concept of, we're fighting this war, our sons and daughters, well, our sons are going off to fight this war, or I'm paying to fight this war. And people just kind of got fed up. I mean, they fed up, especially the most notable draft riots are in New York City. and I think there's even some in Boston, where the immigrant population looked at it like, hey, this is not even my country's war. I don't get the rights of a citizen of this war, yet my son, who just came off the boat, was sent to Tennessee right away to fight the Civil War. And so they become really upset and really disenfranchised about the war when they're A, not going to experience any benefits at the end of the war, and B, they're not getting the rights that they deserve at the time. And so they basically come up and they say, hey, we're not going to put up with this crap. And on top of that, you do have the wealthy buying off their service in the war, and I think that hit the immigrant population pretty hard as well. And so it was right there in New York City. I think back to Theodore Roosevelt's father hired a substitute, and ultimately that substitute was killed. And I've read biographies of Roosevelt and how he talked about his dad was forever affected by the fact that the man whom he hired died. And so, you have that tension between the rich and the poor. The poor's fighting the war. They're not benefiting from it. The rich is going to benefit from it because they're making money off of it. And it just comes to a clash. It comes to an end, or it comes to a riot ultimately in New York and in Boston. And I think Chicago might have had some too, where these people were just fed up.
And 100 years after this, we'll see almost the same exact pattern or theme come back, with people having that same idea of, at Vietnam, what do I stand to gain from this war? And once again, in Vietnam, it's not only poor and lower class. A lot of the young men fighting the war in Vietnam are African Americans who have very few rights and are often abused, dealing with Jim Crow laws in the country, and then they have to fight a war over in Vietnam, which they just don't stand to gain anything fighting it. And we'll have riots throughout the 60s over various things, but the war being one of those central causes. So these themes come back over and over and over. It's very important that we try to look at things not only from the micro level, but definitely the macro level. And these laws are still on the books. If the government were to call us up today and say, we need you to fight this war, whatever war it is, they could do that. Do you ever see that happening again, though, Mr. B?
Probably not now. There's enough intellectual backing to realize that a conscripted army is not a very effective army. I don't know why we just figured that out. It goes all the way back to the Romans. Even back into the Bible, if you volunteer to fight, that's one thing. That's a good thing. If you're forced to fight, I don't think you're going to be as happy to do so. And so we finally figured out after the 60s and 70s, with all that, they've pretty much developed a body of information that says conscripted armies don't work, volunteer armies do. So I don't see it. I don't know. Do you think? I don't think we're ever. The other thing is, I don't think we'll ever enter into a conflict that is as big as World War II or the Civil War or Vietnam, that we need that big of an army. But I could be wrong.
Well, I agree with you. On the other side of the spectrum, a conscriptive army or a drafted army where people don't want to fight, obviously, if people don't want to fight, they're not going to fight, or they're not going to do their best. And the volunteer army, obviously, in the middle of the spectrum, is absolutely what you're gunning for and what you want. But then if you go to the other side of the spectrum, where you have a mercenary army, or you're paying people to fight, then you almost, history tells us that you're going to get pretty similar results to a drafted army. You look at the Roman Empire will fall with mercenaries. The British will use mercenaries during American Revolution. Doesn't really work out too well for them. And even today, a lot of our soldiers, it's a paycheck for some soldiers. And I don't want to say that about all. A lot of the young men and women who fight for our country, young and old, do it because they love our country. But when you don't have a cause, it definitely affects. I understand our armies volunteer today, but
look at our reliance on mercenaries during the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, with these Blackwater and all these guys, and look at all the mess that they got into. They were almost, for lack of a better term, they were almost out to collect scalps, and that led to quite a few problems. So I think you're right. A mercenary army has its effect in limited quantity, but I don't think if you go to a wholesale mercenary army, it's going to be very positive.
Yeah, and then at the other point too is as technology, and you kind of alluded to this, technology increases, it replaces human beings, but that could almost be worse in the long term if you really think about that. Then we run into like Terminator type
Well,
scenarios where they create Skynet and the machines turn on us. But you know what? That seems like a joke, and that would have been more of a joke probably 10 years ago. But as these drones and everything continues to evolve, it's that joke of machines taking over is not as funny as it once was.
no, no, and at the same time though, do you want a kinder? What is it? The song in the Neil Young, kinder, gentler machine gun hand. I don't know. I mean, what do you think? It's all wishy-washy, I guess. You can't really get too much on one side or the other. You can't get conscripted or mercenary. So we'll move on. I see you've moved your slide. So let's move on.
All right, so once again, a little bit of a theme here. We're talking about some of the abuses of government. You could argue that an income tax is a federal government exerting its force and power onto the people when it's basically taking your money. But if you're like me or Mr. B, there's really not much to take. So,
No.
and a draft is once again them forcing you to join the army against your will. Once again, another issue that will pop up is Mr. Lincoln, with his power as the executive of our country, he will suspend the writ of habeas corpus unless you are one of the Roman people we were speaking about earlier. You probably don't know what habeas corpus means, maybe you're a lawyer. If you're a lawyer listening to this, thanks for joining us. But it basically means it means bring forth the body in Latin. Or, in other words, the government can't just arrest you and throw you in jail and let you rot there. You have to be brought to trial. That is a right you have in the Constitution. If you're arrested, accused of something, the government must bring you forward, bring you to trial, and follow due process. Well, during the American Civil War, Lincoln decided, we don't need to do that. And so your right to habeas corpus was suspended. So they could just say, you are a Confederate spy, you are a Confederate, you are going to jail, you are guilty. What are your thoughts on this whole suspension of habeas corpus? Is it nothing? Is it a blip in the radar? Or does this connect to the bigger theme of the Alien and Sedition Acts, today's NSA, spying, George Bush, his treatment of accused terrorists? What do you think?
Well, I think it definitely falls in that heritage of alien sedition on down to George W. Bush. But I think Lincoln struggled with this idea because by doing so, he basically played into the idea that the federal government had taken too much power. But at the same time, he needed to do it. It was a war. He saw it as a wartime necessity. But at the same time, he's fallen into the Confederate drumbeat of, hey, the federal government is too powerful. We need small state right governments. And so I think, like anybody who does something like this, like anybody who suspends rights or liberties, I don't think they take it too lightly. There's arguments that you could make that people do, but I think in the long run, you're right. It falls right in the same line, but at the same, it's kind of a complicated thing because at the same time, I think he needed to be able to suspend habeas corpus in the idea of anybody could have been a Southern spy, and if you are acting like a Southern spy, then you could very well be. I mean, we talked about in the last video how close Richmond was to Washington, D.C. We had Confederate Southern spies infiltrating through Canada, and even invading the North in Vermont from Canada. So, I mean, I think in the end, you do what you have to do as the president, and if it steps on people's toes, I think ultimately you have to sometimes step on people's toes. And I hate saying that I just said that, but I think in the long run, it did hasten the American Civil War's end. That's my opinion, though.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I always follow the phrase of, in order for the government to protect our rights, they have to take away our rights. And that doesn't make any sense, but it does, because today, for the government to protect us from supposed terrorists, They need to be able to spy on us. They need to take away our privacy rights.
Right.
And we could argue this all the time and say, well, I'd rather live in a country that's free and at danger than, be safe without rights.
But you can't do that. You can't say that because you don't really know what it would look like to be at danger.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't, unless we actually run the experiment, we don't know what's going to happen. We know what it's like to be spied on and to feel a little bit of safety. We don't know what it would be like the other way. Well, I mean, I guess we could look at 9/11 and say, well, that's what it's like. I don't know if that's going a little far. But this is just something that happens throughout history, and we hope that once you get through a problem, like the Alien and Sedition Act is an example of we're nearly at war with France, and the government's basically just telling you guys to shut up, don't cause any problems, takes away the freedom of speech of some Americans who speak out. But as time passes, the Alien Sedition Act goes away and things return to normal. Same thing, the Japanese Americans who face internment during World War II. They lost rights. That's awful. But over time, we hopefully make up for them. The problem right now, standing in the middle of things as they happen, will the war on terror ever end? Are we ever going to get our privacy rights back? Do you think? I don't know.
I think ultimately I believe we are starting to see that. I think we're starting to see the idea that our freedoms are going to be returned. I mean, I already feel like, to me at least, this war on terrorism is winding down. I mean, today is the official ending of the last combat troops in Afghanistan, I believe, if I read that correctly. And so, I think we're going to see that, and we may not know until the future just how much freer we are today than we were, say, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. I think it'll take time for us to say, oh yeah, the freedom started returning, such and such date. I think that's the way too with this, and then the Civil War was as things calmed down, people didn't realize they had it so good until after it was over. I think they realized, oh, Lincoln wasn't spying on me. He didn't violate my writ of habeas corpus. And so I think in the long run, there'll come a time when we say, yeah, we had it pretty good. And unfortunately, usually then it's because they've taken our rights back away. It's kind of like you never know you're out of a recession until you're in another recession. It's kind of the same principle of you never know you've had it so good until it sucks again.
That's so true. And to wrap up the habeas corpus part, for the students, it's probably not so much that they remember what is habeas corpus or that Lincoln took away habeas corpus during the Civil War, but the big idea that throughout times, especially during military conflicts, the government will suspend rights. And the key word is suspend, not necessarily take them away, but just suspend. And maybe the government's being a little abusive. Maybe the government is no longer having limited power. But that's just it's very much like an economy in the recessions you talk about. There are ups and downs. There are times when the government has a lot of power, and there's times when the government is very much hands off. And continuing pretty much the theme of the Civil War, where our federal branch, the federal executive branch, probably abused power. The Emancipation Proclamation, while it's on the surface from the the 4th grade, 5th grade teachings of, hey, the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. Well, that's good and all, but when we dig a little bit deeper, I don't know if this is such a good thing. What do you think, Mr. D?
Well, I think ultimately it was something that didn't really it didn't matter. I know that sounds terrible, but it was a law passed intending to govern people who were not even part of the country. Abraham Lincoln says, okay, we're going to free the slaves in basically the Confederate States, and those Confederate States are not in the United States at the time. So I think, and I like your visual there on the left. Are you okay? Are you there?
Yes, I am. Sorry.
So you look at the visual there in the middle. You've got where the exempted southern states and colonies or counties, excuse me, there in West Virginia and then down in lower Louisiana. You've got those because those were areas already under Union control. The target southern states that are kind of in that brown color, those states weren't even part of the country. And so he's passing a law that's, for the most part, a figurative law that says we're going to free slaves. Okay, great. Where are you going to free the slaves? In the South? Well, the South's not part of the country. So I don't know if it's a breach of power, if it's just almost maybe a misuse of power at the time. Now, in the long run, it does give political victories to the North, and it does kind of strengthen the cause of, hey, we're going to fight the Union on the battlefield or fight for the Union on the battlefield. But in my opinion, it's a law that he passed that he really couldn't enforce.
Well, and also, like you said, it's a law that he passed. According to the Constitution, our legislative branch is supposed to pass a law, and he signs it. And so, did he really have authority to just make up his law? I mean, he says it's an executive order, but did he really have the power to do that? And then also, at the same time, what he's saying is that he's going to the old argument of slaves are property, and during war, it's okay to seize property. It's okay to seize weapons. It's okay to seize land and forts, and it's okay for our soldiers to seize and take the slaves on that basis. And so it's a much more complicated document than most people will say, well, he freed the slaves in the Emancipation Proclamation. It's much more difficult than that. There's a lot of different views on, I mean, I guess overall, as a political move and as a move towards the abolition of slavery, I say great.
Oh, yeah, and it's a political, for sheer politics, it's political because he was using the tools that he had. He was operating within the confines of the Constitution to do something that ultimately wasn't in the Constitution to begin with, and was a power that was just vaguely mentioned in the Constitution. So you're right. He clawed slaves' property so that he could free them. Yeah, it's not the greatest thing on paper to say, and it's certainly not, even in 2014, it's not easy to say, but Lincoln called slaves property so that he could ultimately free them. And that's, I mean, politically, it's a genius move because like I said, he's using the confines of the Constitution to, very sketchily, I mean, it was very sketchy and very thinly sanctioned, but he still took advantage of what he had. If he had said, we're going to free the slaves, and they're not going to be property, I don't think he could have ever had anything passed.
You know, in the end, it would have looked a lot better if someone was freed. I mean, if Missouri and Kentucky were actually freed their slaves, but they didn't have to.
Right.
The Union states didn't have to free their slaves, only the Confederate states. But then at the same time, it wouldn't have been a political victory had he done that. It's a pure political document. If you like politics, then this is your thing. But outside of that, I don't know. And I've had African American professors in the past say, you know, that like the praise that Abraham Lincoln receives for this Emancipation Proclamation is really ridiculous because it's a pure political move. It's not a move aimed at, hey, I love African Americans, so I want to free slaves. It's just trying to win a war.
Right. Well, and you mentioned the border states of Missouri and Kentucky. If he had made them free their slaves, they could have just as easily gone into the South. They could have just as easily seceded. Maryland and Delaware as well. And so, you know, he's having to dance. He's tap dancing through a minefield.
Yeah.
And I think in the long run, he did a pretty good job getting through unscathed. Now, he might have thrown, you know, some rocks on some landmines so that they blew up and he knew where they were. But I think in the long run, he did a pretty good job of skirting the issue. Now, I know as a Southerner, I'm not supposed to necessarily defend Mr. Lincoln, but I think in the long run, as far as political maneuvering is concerned, that was pretty genius.
Yeah, very clever. Let's move on to probably then. Well, I guess maybe if we're talking about the genius that is Abraham Lincoln, probably the number one on your Family Feud rankings would be the Gettysburg Address. If we were trying, and I think if we surveyed 100 people and they were talking about the wisdom of Abraham Lincoln, I believe Gettysburg Address would be number one. What would you say? Are you just going to say, well, freed slaves?
I disagree. I don't know. The more I read about the Gettysburg Address, the more I realize that this was something that people blew up after it happened, particularly after Lincoln was assassinated. I think in the long run, the Gettysburg Address was a speech that he kind of got conned into doing and didn't put a whole lot of thought into it and wrote it on the way there, just like any other president does. They have to go talk to, the fourth grade class at such and such school. Okay, I'll write some stuff down on a paper napkin on the way into the school building. I think now it's a beautiful speech. It's a great speech. It's well written and it shows the mental capacity of Lincoln. But in the long run, I think it's just another speech that he had to write, and he didn't really probably want to give it. And the fact that it took 4 minutes and 30 seconds to say, we've been talking about it more than he spoke on it. So I think in the long run, it's just another speech. But sometimes I'm a little cynical.
Let's look at it this way, though. Let's draw an analogy to modern times, and I'll reference the Beatles, but I know a lot of my students aren't going to really. That's not going to matter to them. It's no fault of their own. But think about how many songs John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote, and some of the songs they wrote became the greatest songs of all time. Some of them became good songs, and some of those songs were just thrown together in a couple seconds. Like Yesterday, it's just a simple, really quick melody on the acoustic guitar. How long do you think Paul McCartney spent around on that? Like, hey, when we talk about some of these outliers or individuals that are geniuses, sometimes I think that they just, how many speeches did he have to write? How many speeches is he constantly giving? Eventually, one of them becomes a big hit. And I don't think saying that, well, you only spent a couple minutes on it. Sometimes songs or ideas just come to your head and it works perfectly.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't work like that. Yeah. It's a very simple speech, but, very simple songs sometimes are the most catchy, the ones that we remember. And that's probably why it was so successful. He just threw it together. I mean, had he labored over it, it might have been too complex, like many of the other speeches that we don't really talk about from him.
I think you're right. I think about the speech that in the movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis, where he's talking about he raises the flag at a post office, and he says, basically, I'm raising a flag by a mechanical measure, and it's our job to keep it there. Now, you think about that, okay, that's a really simple, and people, like in the movie, you can tell that people are waiting for him to keep talking, but he just stops. And I think that's what the Gettysburg Address was, is that he was saying something deep, and I think he knew he was saying something deep, but in the long run, that was the way he was. I think Abraham Lincoln spewed forth genius every time he spoke, but so the Gettysburg Address falls right in that. I don't know.
We're not going to spend time reading the speech because we're already going to go way over, and you might have your own part that you find more significant or the most important, but to me, understanding American history and understanding civics and government and understanding all of our politics and economics, really just the last sentence is really, if you can understand that last sentence and you understand how our system works, of the people, a government by the people, and for the people. That's basically it. That's America in just a couple simple words. If you want to know how America works, well, there it is. We create the government, we run the government, and the government is to serve us. That's basically everything right there. When you wake up in the morning today and tomorrow, that's it. That's the way it should be and always will be. It's very simple, very smart, and he just changes a couple prepositions. And this guy it's pretty smart. I mean, that's really like a songwriter coming up with really catchy hook.
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, I'm not knocking his genius. Like I said, I think he spewed forth genius anytime he spoke. But this is the one that we decide to focus on. It could have been just as easily the speech he gave the day before, in my opinion. Though, I mean, it kind of cheapens the Gettysburg Address, but also magnifies Lincoln at the same time. Anyway,
moving forward. So, one thing that we always kind of skim past is that during the Civil War, he had to get elected again. And he does, which we mentioned in the other video, with help from William Tecumseh Sherman. But, I don't know, it's just interesting to think that when we look back at history, we think, Lincoln was there the whole time and Lincoln was in charge the whole time. But really, as we now look at history more from a higher level as opposed to what we were taught in 4th grade, we realize that it really wasn't that simple for Mr. Lincoln.
No, and I think here is a prime example of showing Lincoln adhering to the system. He could have probably suspended the election of 1864 and just said, no, I'm going to run this thing until the end of the war. There's probably ways that he could have outmaneuvered the election of 1864, but instead he decides to run. So, I mean, again, it's showing that Lincoln is a master of the system in which he operates in.
And even when Lincoln abused his power, and I'm using the word abused kind of on my own terms, but even when he probably overstepped his bounds, I don't think he was necessarily happy about what he was doing.
No, I don't think so either. I don't think he did it lightly, and I don't think he did it with pleasure. I think he did it because he had to. Like anybody who's in a political office, I think a lot of times they don't, enjoy doing what they have to do, but they have to do it because it's their job. I can't believe I just said that.
And continuing the idea of working within the system, which I know that you hate working within the system.
I like to change the system.
Part of the way our Constitution works is if you want to change the Constitution, there are rules written. You can see them on the screen. The first step in actually changing our Constitution is our Congress has to, not just a majority, but needs a 2/3 vote of yes on that proposed amendment. And the amendment we're going to talk about is the 13th Amendment. So our Congress, the House of Representatives and Senate, 2/3 of that body must vote yes. Then it moves on to state legislatures or state congresses. And the congresses of each of those states must vote yes or no. And if 75% or 3/4 of those states say yes, we then amend the Constitution. And that's important because in the past, we just talked about how Mr. Lincoln kind of went his own way several times, maybe used more authority and more power than he was really granted by the Constitution to do certain things. But he knew when it came to the end of slavery, he had to follow it legally in order for everyone really to follow it. He had to follow the rules, and he will. And that's really the movie that came out, or the book by, what was her name, Doris Kearns
Goodwin.
Goodwin, that documents how he gets this done. The Lincoln movie is really good if you really like politics and want to find how he follows and navigates our political system to follow the process. So he gets Congress to vote 2/3 yes, and he gets 3/4 of the states, you can see on the map in the blue, to also agree to add this 13th Amendment, which basically bans slavery. Some states, I think we looked up earlier, Georgia was the last of the 3/4. Once Georgia had voted yes in their state legislative body, then that had gotten to 35% or 75%. The states you see in the purple and in the green would approve the 13th Amendment later, but really they didn't have to because the 3/4 was already in. And I'm really looking at this from the small level, the micro level of banning slavery. What is your take on this whole thing?
I have to agree with you on that because it's where the federal government becomes really small. And I know that seems kind of silly, but it does. It goes back to the federal government being bound by the states and ultimately bound by the people to do the job of the government. I mean, the people elected their state representatives, and the state representatives ultimately get to make the decision on a constitutional amendment, and then all the other states have to jump in on the bandwagon too. And so I think it's almost too, if you think about it, with some different filters on it and different ways of looking at it, it's almost a nod back to the states' rights even after the Civil War's over. It's like, hey, you still as a state pick whether or not something is passed into the Constitution. Even though we just fought a civil war to say states don't have the right to do certain things, states also have the right to do other certain things. And so I think it's a kind of it's a balance. It's a big, huge ball of mess, but it's also a balance of no states can't allow slavery, but states can still make decisions to the Constitution. And so it's kind of a compromise in a theoretical sense, I guess. Does that make much sense?
No, but it does.
No, but it doesn't. No, that's how it works.
and I think that's one of the reasons why some students hate social studies. Because it's a paradox. Because, like you said, the Civil War is an example of the federal government saying, this is a country, the federal government has power. We are a federalist system. We have the authority. But then when it actually comes to the 13th Amendment, it's the opposite. Because then each state gets to say, no, we decide ultimately whether this is added. And so when you try to tell someone, like I explained to a student, we have a federal system where the federal government has the authority, and the federal government is strong in our country. But it isn't. It is, but it isn't. These are the stuff that melts students' minds because there's just so many layers, and up is down sometimes. It's the same thing. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier. In order for the government to protect your rights, they're going to take your rights.
You're right. Right.
So I'm sorry that it's so crazy. And then Lincoln will be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth.
Oh gosh, I just saw that picture in the upper left-hand corner.
I know. Maybe it's too graphic, but this is 2014. I think it's okay. I think it's not too soon to show these
Mr. D. It's not too soon. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. Mr.
I guess
D.
This moment doesn't really go into the politics of anything. This is more of an event where some students are really interested with the assassination of presidents. This probably connects to the same audience that really likes to study battles. Once again, had this been 10, 15 years ago, we spend an entire week analyzing the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and all the conspiracies. But today, as social studies teachers, we don't talk about this anymore. When the president gets killed and all the conspiracies and all the stuff that people used to be interested in, I think that they're still interested in, we're just not allowed to talk about them because we have to talk about only things that are really big and only matter today. Do you agree with that?
I would agree. I think you could probably say, oh, okay, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, but you ask by whom, and they may not even answer that. And then you might even ask the question, well, what in the world was John Wilkes Booth doing in the theater? I mean, you think about that. I mean, there's layers upon layers upon layers of the Lincoln assassination. You can get into the conspiracy stuff. And that's what stinks about what we have to do is, okay, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 15th, something like that, April 19th, 20th, somewhere around in there. And, that's it. Okay, cool. Well, why did John Wilkes Booth kill Abraham Lincoln? What connections did he have? It's to me, it's a fascinating thing. I mean, there's layers upon layers. Again, there's layers upon layers of interesting stuff with the Lincoln assassination that we can't even get into. We're spending too much time now talking about it for something that may not even show up on the test.
Yeah, it is really one of the shame. It's just, and I'm sure about in 15 years from now, things will go back to us talking about these events to get students excited about social studies. And get students excited about these crazy events that affect. This will change how the country will grow because Andrew Johnson will take over. Andrew Johnson will get to guide Reconstruction in the South as opposed to Abraham Lincoln rebuilding the South. And we can make connections to today, I mean, especially with people jumping over the fence. I think there was a guy who jumped over the fence in the White House just 2 days ago before he was attacked by dogs. People are trying to assassinate our president. But once again, there probably won't be a test question. And so if there's not a test question, there's no data. And if there's not any data, then
we don't
talk about it.
Right.
But I do encourage students to definitely look into some of the conspiracies and really everything involving the assassination of Abraham Lincoln or Kennedy or any of these guys, because it's just interesting when a political leader is murdered.
Yep. I think an interesting thing, just to plant the seed. This is a plant the seed. Take a look at the conspiracies involving it, and you're going to love this. Take a look at the conspiracies involving the Freemasons and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. You're going to jump off the cliff, Mr. D, but it is pretty interesting.
Well, I'm not a Freemason, so I don't have to feel bad about that. But,
Well, I don't feel bad either, but especially being a Freemason from Tennessee, which is where Andrew Johnson was from, and he was a Freemason, so I don't feel bad about it.
Just for some of the students listening, just look up Freemasons. They would be interested to find out what really goes on with the Freemasons.
Oh, I'm sure they would.
I don't know. Just check it out. All right, so some of the, I guess, less controversial things that will happen politically during the Civil War is the Homestead Act, which is basically the government giving free land to anyone who was willing to move west and to settle land, which is a pretty good deal. I wish the government would give us free land today. That's not going to happen.
You can. You can go get land right now from the government.
Yeah, where at?
Alaska.
Hey, you are right. You're absolutely right, because the government will pay you to live in Alaska and take that land. Maybe that's what I'll do.
I don't think you want to go where they're going to offer the land, though. That's the thing. That's the big difference between then and now is, you're offering up good farmland in Nebraska and in the Midwest or the West, basically. Now we get land in Alaska and Montana and stuff that's not livable. So I wouldn't suggest homesteading now, but you could try it back then. I definitely would have back then.
And we can't say the Homestead Act is not without controversy. There's other issues we can dive into. I guess probably the biggest will be that as the West is settled, and we talked about this before, is the West going to be a land for, kind of as as Thomas Jefferson envisioned it, land for the people to grow their farms, or is the West going to be giant plantations filled with slaves? And that's a big issue that pretty much pushes the Civil War to the limit of, who is this country for? Is it for the people or is it for the rich? And that idea still is coming up today, especially with political campaigns and elections all over the TV, especially in our state. Who is this country for? Is it for the people or is it for the elite and the wealthy? Unfortunately, we never really get these answered.
No, I don't think so.
And then probably a little less controversial, and we'll talk more about probably the Pacific Railway Acts in the future, but I guess from our North Carolina students' perspective, roads and railroads and canals are important to the growth of a nation, and one of the problems that North Carolina has is that the government of North Carolina never really invests in the early 1800s in roads, in canals, and their economy suffers in competition with Virginia and South Carolina. Now, you can see probably the map right now, you're saying, wait a second, there's a railroad in North Carolina right there. Well, yeah, now, during this time period, but I can't stress the importance of how vital railroads and roads are to the economy and to the growth of a nation. And then going along with that is, there's really only one person that can build railroads or get these things going, at least today, and that's the government. Even the railroads that were built by independent companies had to have help and assistance from the government.
Oh yeah. One of my newest favorite shows is a show called Hell on Wheels, and it talks all about the government and how they have to get contracts and you get paid so much per land per mile that you build, and I mean it's fantastic. It's an interesting time in history, and you talk about. I've taken a couple of classes talking about North Carolina, talking about let me make sure I get this right, the western part of North Carolina and how hard it was to build railroads there and the effects of that on Appalachian North Carolina and Virginia and Tennessee, and that's a critical part to the lack of development in the eastern part of Tennessee and the western part of North Carolina is the lack of railroads. So railroads are huge. I mean, that's a huge commodity to have. If you can have a railroad close by, you can put your crops that you've grown on the railroad and send it to anywhere you need to get a fair price and to get a good price on your crop. And if you can't do that, then you're going to have to pay the price, or you're going to have to sell it for the price that you can get, and that ultimately hurts a farmer because it's not free market.
Yeah.
How's that work for you?
That's absolutely that is absolutely perfect. I mean, these are not things that are part of our past. These are definitely still true today. You can go through the Appalachian Mountains. You can go through a lot of parts. Well, you won't be able to go through them, but you can see many places of our country that struggle or do not have thriving economies and thriving industrial sectors because they did not or were unable to build railroads, or were unable to build roads or canals or interstates, or didn't have the assistance and the help of a government to build that. And those places are, still are fine today, but there aren't as many jobs, and the markets aren't quite as free. Workers may not get paid as much today.
Connecting to the outside world, I think, is what you're trying to say, and that's ultimately what you got to do, is be able to connect to the outside world. You can't just look at what you can see. You have to look past and look on and beyond, and be able to be connected to that. So that's what you got to do, is you got to be able to be connected to things. And railroads did it then, interstates do it now, on down the line.
And going a little out there, but connecting the same idea of being connected to the world. Today the theme is more of internet. And while most people are saying, well, I've got internet, everybody's got internet everywhere. Well, that's not necessarily true. There isn't high-speed internet everywhere. And in those places where they do not have high-speed internet, there's a lot more poverty, there's less opportunities. You're not going to build manufacturing sectors in areas that are not connected to the world. And going even a step further, because, as Mr. B just said, you got to look forward. Really, what the next race is going to be is faster internet. People might say, well, what's the difference between a nanosecond? But there actually is a huge difference. If you think about the stock market, I know we're going really out there with these ideas, but think about online. Online, people are buying and selling stocks, or buying and selling parts of companies, and it's happening every second at the speed of light. And this is all happening to places that are directly connected to super duper crazy high-speed internet in New York and in Chicago. Those people have access to this super fast Ethernet where they can buy and sell incredibly fast. And places that are not connected to that super fast internet, they can't do business. And so right now you're actually seeing tons of buildings in New York and in Chicago, and everything is along this kind of imaginary line, I guess. It's weird, but I don't know. I'm going way too far off topic, and I apologize.
Oh no, you're good. You're right. I mean, it's all about connection. It's all about being able to, and I think that's what the standards in our curriculum are trying to show us, is the idea of being connected, and being able to be as connected as fast as you possibly can. And that's what I think. That's why they have that there. Is to be able to be connected in any way, even if it's a slow way. A slow way is better than no way. A fast way is even better than a slow way. So you have to just do that. You have to constantly be more and more connected.
I guess to put it on and once again, bring it more modern and a little easier to understand for North Carolina students, the biggest next issue, I think, would be light-speed rails. If you don't know a light-speed rail, just imagine a super-fast railroad. So this is a little easier for us to understand. But if you have a super-fast railroad throughout North Carolina, it becomes easier for people to move about the state. It becomes easier for people not only to move about our state, but to other states and work in other states. And also it becomes easier to move goods back and forth, even though I don't know if on a light-speed rail too many goods would be shipped. But the next question is, okay, well, why don't we do that? Well, that comes up to our government. Should our government help this process? Should our government not help this process? You'll say, well, that's a no-brainer. Do it. Well, that's going to be tax dollars that will pay for it. Will another state jump over us and take the opportunity to build a light-speed rail? I don't know. What are your thoughts, Mr. B? Do we build a light-speed rail? Do we say, we don't need it? What do you think?
Well, I think that if we don't do it, and this goes with anything, if you don't do it, then somebody else will, and they'll have the advantage. You have to take the advantage of, if you're given an opportunity to do something, you should do it. Otherwise, somebody else will, and then they'll reap the benefits that you could have reaped, and ultimately you'll have to pay double in the future what it takes to do so. I mean, going back to what I alluded to earlier with the Appalachian Railroad, if they had, it ultimately it costs more for them to have to catch up than it did to just have done it to begin with. If North Carolina builds a light rail now, it will be cheaper ultimately than to have to try to catch up in the future. And so
with
I
the
think
other states, yeah.
with the other states, because South Carolina will be able to do it cheaper in the future. Virginia will be able to do it cheaper in the future. Tennessee will be able to do it in the future cheaper. North Carolina has to seize the opportunity, otherwise other states will, and they'll bypass North Carolina, and then North Carolina's stuck playing catch-up, and catch-up is more expensive than doing it right away. And I know that seems silly and it seems backwards, but that's just the way it is, because you have to bring up to speed, and then maybe you can catch up in the get ahead in the future. Think about a foot race. If I give you a 15-second advantage, how much harder am I going to have to run to even just break even with you, and then I'm going to have to run even harder just to finish before you. So,
and it connects to that idea from our standards in economics of cooperation and competition, because it's not just if North Carolina builds a light rail, it has to go somewhere, and it probably will have to go through another state, so we have to work together with Virginia's government to plan out where should this thing go, work with Maryland and work with Washington, D.C. Different state, local governments and investors will have to cooperate to build this thing. But also there's going to be competition, because what if Raleigh-Durham area wants the light rail to go through there, but maybe Greensboro has a plan that will run the railway through Greensboro, through the western part of North Carolina. So then you have factions within the state competing with each other, and it's complicated.
It is. Oh yeah, it's a super complicated area. But ultimately too, and this is an economic theory here, the competition is going to make it better. If Greensboro can prove that the light rail through Greensboro is better than Raleigh-Durham, and they can actually prove it, and they can show it and show the benefits and show the long-term effect of it, then that's what will happen, and that ultimately, ideally, will help all of North Carolina. Why will it help all of North Carolina? Because then maybe Raleigh-Durham steps up and builds a spur of light rail from Raleigh-Durham to Greensboro. Well, that helps everybody in between, because they'll have stops between Raleigh and Greensboro. So you have to think and do and have some kind of vision that sometimes I think the state of North Carolina lacks. But I didn't say that out loud.
Well, I think history tells us that.
Yeah,
and we can
I
see
think history ultimately tells us that.
If you follow all these railroad lines and even interstate highway lines, all the places that are connected benefit. They grow. Their economies are much better. And what you run into is what we're running into now, or slowly but surely, because of our North Carolina government. There will be a bidding war. There will be a fight. Once they finally realize they're going to build the light rail, it's going to be basically a knockdown, drag-out fight for who gets it to go through where. I imagine Raleigh is definitely going to get it.
Oh yeah, without a doubt, it's the largest city. It's the largest city. It's the
But you also going to see cities like Charlotte. They're going to say, "Hey, but we're Charlotte. The thing, maybe it'll cut through Raleigh, but that thing better cut hard to the west and run through Charlotte." And this happened in the past with all the railroad lines, with all the canals that were built. It ultimately comes down to these local governments and the people saying, we want it here. And some people saying, no, we don't want it here. Some places, like where I used to live, Danville, Virginia, had an opportunity to build an interstate through Danville, and Danville said, nah, we don't need all that traffic.
Yeah.
And now Danville is a city that it's not much more of a city. It's a dead, old southern town that is slowly fading away. But ultimately, it was up to the people, and the people elect the politicians that make the laws, that build these roads, that build these railroads, that build these canals, that build these high-speed railways. So in the end, really, we have no one to blame but ourselves.
I think what we're saying is summed up pretty well, and my students in my class watch this video, which is the gazelle and lion speech that the railroad magnate gives on Hell on Wheels on the very end of the first episode, and he talks about how The lion kills the zebra, and that's the natural order. And people don't like it if they're the zebras, but they love it when they're the lions. And but at the same time too, he talks about how they vilify the lion for killing the zebra because the zebra is who everybody wants to, cheer for. But ultimately, you're right. I think you have to adapt or you die. If you there's a reason Raleigh is the way it is, and there's a reason that Danville, Virginia is the way it is, and Raleigh's at least looked at, hey, we've done things in the past to adapt and to grow. We're going to have to do something else to adapt and to grow now. It's just the only thing you have to do.
All right, so we've kind of went full circle there.
Yeah,
pretty much covered it all.
We have
talked about which I guess is going to happen as we continue to create more videos. I imagine we will get. I imagine we're going to do a little less
pontification.
No, I think we'll probably do more of that and stick less to the script.
That's fine. It's all good.
Thanks for joining us. I don't know if you're still with us. If you are, thank you.
Lord help you.
I think you know where these are going to start to go. But I guess the next one we'll do, I don't know if we're necessarily going to follow the timeline. We can do one on Reconstruction and bring that modern, I guess, if that's what we're going to do. You suppose we should do that next?
We should adapt.
Not right now, but I mean in the future.
We should adapt or die. So yeah, sure. Let's do Reconstruction. Let's do it all. We'll just bring everything modern until we get to the modern.
And then we'll make the modern.
We'll do it.
Thanks for joining us, guys. We'll see you next time.